In August of 2023, Russell Moore, who is a former top Southern Baptist Church official, who now is the editor of Christianity Today, it's a fairly conservative periodical, said during an interview aired on NPR that evangelical Christianity is in a crisis, in quotes, due to the current state of right-wing politics. Moore said that he had spoken to many evangelical preachers who, when quoting Jesus' sayings from the Sermon on the Mount, get sharp criticism from their members for touting, and this is a quote, liberal talking points. You remember the Sermon on the Mount? The Beatitudes, in which Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the merciful, even blessed are the meek." When those preachers responded to their members that these are literally the words of Jesus, the comeback is generally, well, that doesn't work anymore. It's weak. It's foolish. Wow. It might be foolish. It might be weak, too. But these are the words spoken of the person we believe is God in human form. According to the Apostle Paul, those on the outside, those not in the know, preaching Christ crucified, looks just like that, doesn't it? Foolishness? Think about it. Think about it. Consider the evidence. A God who became a human being. Isn't that supposed to be the other way around? Aren't we supposed to aspire to be gods? A God who was spit upon, mocked, and made fun of. What God would allow that to happen? A God who was harassed in some backwater of an empire by two bit snarky soldiers. Aren't gods supposed to be the empire, the ones in control, the main men? And perhaps most foolish, a God who died. How can God die? It's ridiculous. And then, of course, we know it gets worse. This God cannot stay dead, but lives on and appears to his followers in the breaking of little crumbs of bread and the pouring of sometimes sickeningly sweet, cheap wine, or appears in the ordinary water poured onto the head of an infant or an adult. And if that weren't enough, this God's story gets told and retold in order to invoke that God's very presence. If that isn't foolishness, I don't know what is. William Willimon, a former bishop of the Methodist Church, said it this way: "One of the dangers of being in church as often as I am is that it all starts to make sense. I think of the Christian faith so casually and effortlessly that I begin to think, fine thing this Christianity, makes good sense. And then I find myself believing all sorts of things in the church that I wouldn't let anyone pull over me on in the real world." Foolishness indeed. The Apostle Paul was keenly aware of the apparent foolishness of the gospel. In his first letter, right at the beginning of his letter, he wastes no time in addressing the issue. In a different translation than what we heard this morning, Eugene Peterson translates it this way: "The message that points to Christ on the cross seems like sheer silliness to those hell-bent on destruction, but for those on the way of salvation, it makes perfect sense. This is the way God works, and most powerfully, as it turns out. It is written, I'll turn conventional wisdom on its head. I'll expose so-called experts as crackpots." Foolishness, silliness, weakness to some, But for those on the way of salvation, it makes perfect sense. Foolishness is the opposite of wisdom. It's not stupidity, which is a lack of knowledge. Being a fool means you're just not wise. Nobody wants to be a fool. In this society, fools are not suffered gladly. We want to be seen as wise and serious and capable and strong. Nobody wants to be reviled and laughed at as someone not in possession of wisdom. If you are a fool, you might get taken, or you might look stupid, or you might be cast aside in favor of someone else, or you might be, as they say, a 98-pound weakling. It's mighty important that one appear to be wise and strong. But then, consider this religion we follow, this faith we subscribe to, that God became a human being, that God died, and that God overcame death. Not conventional wisdom by any stretch of the imagination, that death can be overcome by life, that despair can be overcome by hope, that fear can be overcome by love. Foolishness, all of it, foolishness. Don't we know better? Doesn't conventional wisdom teach us otherwise? Don't we know that we need to defend ourselves and our borders? Don't we know that the only way to prosper is to take care of ourselves and our own? Don't we know that what we don't fear will ultimately kill us? Don't we know that if we aren't on guard, others will take what is rightfully ours? What about charity begins at home? Or you've got your own life to lead? Or even, business is business. Yes, we are steeped in this wisdom from our birth. But it may be that this conventional wisdom is the ultimate folly. For the ways of our God lead us in a different way. For those on the way of salvation, such foolishness makes sense. Now, the way of salvation is a curious notion, because in the Hebrew, the words that are translated in the Christian scriptures as salvation or saved are military terms that literally mean to make wide, to make sufficient, to make freer, broader, roomier, providing more space. The way of salvation, then, to widen our sphere of understanding, to widen our hearts, our faith, and note clearly here that Paul does not talk so much about us being saved as if it was some sort of done deal in the past. Paul understands that we are on a path of salvation, a journey, a movement, a walk. And if we are in the process of being saved, we are making paths wider and roomier and broader and more sufficient to understand and to walk the way of God. Our faith is not about some narrowing ourselves into an assent to some fervent questioning about our ultimate salvation. Have you been saved? It's the wrong question. Have you begun to open your life to the widening, gracious, seemingly foolish, all-encompassing love of God? Might be more like it. Now, if we're not careful here, we might read Paul's grand treatise as anti-intellectual. There have been those who have read this passage as a diatribe against learning, to suggest that Paul offers us a doctrine of empty-headed Pollyanna faith that celebrates a mind that is closed and narrow. But that's not what Paul means. God does not create our heart and our mind to wage a battle with each other. God's wisdom has never asked for a book to be banned or an image destroyed. Instead, God's wisdom is a different kind of wisdom, a wisdom that is deep and true, a wisdom that is not concerned with appearance or association. Precisely what the apostle opposes is the wisdom that is not wise, the wisdom that uses knowledge to put others down, the wisdom that points to self only, the wisdom that perpetuates violence and war, the wisdom that upholds strongmen and conspiracy theories. God's wisdom looks like foolishness or weakness to the world precisely because it turns the world conventional wisdom on its head. Jesus' death on a cross can only be foolishness to those whose main orientation is to some form of power. But to those who can transcend that orientation, the powerlessness of crucifixion breaks the cycle of violence and prepares for the resurrection. Because in death and resurrection is the pattern of events that shows God's definitive way of dealing with evil, not by destroying it, but by transforming it. This new covenant offered to us by God is available to anyone who can set aside their own expectations of power and give their heart to the seeming foolishness of the proclamation of God. We serve a God who comes into a brutish world to touch and heal our wounds. The first part of that incarnation story is Jesus' birth and ministry of healing, and the second part is what we remember in Lent. It's a journey that culminates with the Holy Week commemorating a painful and shameful torture upon a Roman cross. Even in the triumphal ride into Jerusalem, which we celebrate on Palm Sunday, there was an earthly and foolish occurrence. Jesus did the very, very undignified thing. He poked fun at his worshipers and his detractors. He didn't ride in on a steed. He rode humbly on the back of a baby donkey. It's as if our president would ride in an inaugural parade, not in one of those bulletproof cars surrounded by the Secret Service, but instead on one of those little go-karts that the Shriners drive in parades. That's how ridiculous it was. With that foolish donkey ride, Jesus fulfilled the messianic promises and taught us something about what is indeed wise and what is indeed foolish. The great good news is that the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are on the way of being saved, it is the power of God. We have the benefit of almost 2,000 years of trying to get our mind around this notion, and it is still difficult for all of us who wish not to look foolish or weak. The message of the cross is simple. God stands with the persecuted, God stands with the forsaken, God's love for the world will never be extinguished. Not by the worst tyrant, not by the most despotic regime, not even by the failings of God's ragtag people. That message only makes sense to those who are being saved on that broad and wide pathway to salvation, serving our neighbors, working for justice and peace in this very violent, war-torn world. The way of hope and light, nonviolence and peace are not weak or foolish. In fact, they are the only way this world can ever be saved. To God be the glory. Amen.